The moment my father said it, the entire table went quiet. I'm Nora, and I'm 32 years old, and I teach 3rd grade at a public elementary school 20 minutes from the house where my husband and I have built everything we have together. I was sitting at table 9 at my father Vincent's retirement gala, a ballroom event at the Harrington Hotel, 200 guests, centerpieces that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and my father was making a toast. He had been speaking for about 4 minutes, which is 3 minutes longer than a toast needs to be, but Vincent had never been a man who understood the value of brevity when an audience was available. He talked about the company. He talked about his legacy. He talked about Sophia, my sister, 30 at the time, who ran the family's East Coast division and had the particular quality of people who have been told they're exceptional for so long they've stopped questioning it. And then he looked at me, across the room, with the indulgent expression of a man about to be generous, and said, "And of course Nora, is still doing her little school project. We're very proud of her too." Little school project. Ethan's hand found mine under the table. His grip was steady and warm, and I felt rather than heard the slight shift in his breathing, the controlled kind, the kind he used when something required restraint rather than response. He had been doing that for 4 years at family events. Holding still. Saying little. Watching. I smiled. I raised my glass with everyone else. I said nothing. But something had reached its limit in me that evening, and I felt it the way you feel a structural change, not dramatic, not sudden, but final. The way a door closes that won't open again from the same direction. Let me explain what I mean by little school project, and why it landed the way it did. I had been hearing variations of it for 10 years. Since I was 22 and announced, at a family dinner with the careful courage of someone who has rehearsed her words in the bathroom mirror, that I intended to become a teacher. Not join the family's commercial real estate business, which was what Vincent had been planning since approximately the year I was born. Not pursue the MBA he'd already researched programs for. Teach 3rd graders to read. The reaction had been, in my father's measured vocabulary, disappointing. In my mother Catherine's more emotional register, it had been treated as a kind of temporary aberration, a phase Diana was going through, something she'd work out of her system. Sophia had said nothing and smiled the smile she always used when she was pleased that attention had shifted away from herself. 10 years later, I was still teaching, still loved it, still came home on Friday afternoons with the particular exhaustion and fulfillment of someone who has spent the week doing work that matters. And my family had maintained, with remarkable consistency, the position that this was a charming if slightly puzzling life choice, the way some families talk about a relative who collects unusual stamps. Ethan was the piece of this picture my family had never properly examined. We'd been together 6 years, married 4. He worked in technology, that was the official description, vague by his preference, which my family had never thought to probe. He drove a practical car. He wore simple clothes. He was unfailingly polite at family events and said exactly enough and never more, and because he didn't perform wealth or status in any of the ways my father recognized, Vincent had concluded early that Ethan was a pleasant nonentity, a man who'd failed to amount to anything significant, well matched to a daughter who'd done the same. My father had said this, not to Ethan's face but in the way of people who don't consider certain audiences worth the discretion of silence, at a Christmas dinner 3 years ago. I had heard it through the kitchen door. Ethan, sitting across the table from me at the time, had heard nothing, or had chosen to appear to hear nothing, which I understood now was not the same thing. Looking back at that Christmas dinner, I understand it was the first moment I should have recognized what was accumulating. Not just my father's contempt for Ethan, I had been living with contempt for my own choices for years and had developed a kind of practiced management of it. What I should have noticed was Ethan's response, the complete stillness of a man who has made a decision about how long he will wait before saying something. I had read it as patience. It was something more specific than patience. The gala was in April. The invitation had arrived in February, formal, embossed, my name printed slightly smaller than Sophia's on the family table card. I had almost not gone. Ethan had said, quietly, that he thought we should. I had asked why. He had said, I think it's time. I hadn't understood what he meant. I was about to. My classroom smelled like crayons and the particular dry warmth of a building that has housed children for decades. I had 24 students that year, an energetic, complicated, occasionally exhausting group that I had come to love with the specific depth you develop for people you've watched learn something difficult and do it anyway. We were working through fractions in February, which is always the month that separates the children who trust the process from the ones who need to see why it works before they'll commit to it. I found, year after year, that I preferred the second group. They asked better questions. My colleague Rachel taught second grade 2 doors down and had been my closest friend at the school for 3 years. She was direct and funny and had an instinct for knowing when to offer advice and when to simply be present that I had come to rely on more than I'd admitted. On a Tuesday in late February, she found me in the break room at lunch staring at the Gala invitation on my phone. "What's that expression?" she said. "My father's retirement dinner," I said. "April 15th. She looked at the invitation over my shoulder. "Harrington Hotel. That's the one on the waterfront." "Yes." "Are you going?" I put my phone down and looked at the window. "Ethan thinks we should." "And you?" I thought about it, really thought about it, in the way I rarely allowed myself to think about my family during school hours, where I had learned to keep those two worlds cleanly separated. "I don't know what I'm walking into," I said. "That's the part that makes me hesitant." Rachel said nothing for a moment. Then, "Has Ethan ever said anything specific? About why he thinks you should go?" I shook my head. "He said it was time." "Time for what?" I didn't have an answer. At home, Ethan and I had a life that was, from the outside, unremarkable in the best sense. Our house was in a quiet neighborhood, a craftsman bungalow we'd renovated slowly over 4 years, each room done with the deliberate attention of people who intended to be somewhere for a long time. Ethan had done most of the work himself, on weekends and in the evenings, with a focused capability that I had long since stopped being surprised by. He cooked well. He read a lot. He had a home office where he spent 2 or 3 hours most mornings before I left for school, the door ajar, the sound of occasional calls that I never tried to listen to because he'd never asked me to. He managed something technology-related. He had described it to me once, early in our relationship, as an education technology platform, and I had understood the broad outline and not pressed further. I realize, now, what a significant thing that was. That I had not pressed. I had not pressed because it wasn't my instinct to interrogate the people I trusted, and because Ethan had always been transparent about what he wanted me to know and quiet about the rest, and because I had never had reason to connect his professional life to anything that would matter outside our home. He talked about work the way some people talk about a project they love, with specific enthusiasm about problems and solutions, never about scale or money. I had taken that at face value. Looking back, I understand that Ethan wasn't concealing anything from me. He was simply waiting to say it in the right place, at the right time, to the right audience. On a Thursday evening in March, he mentioned the gala again. We were at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes done, the particular quiet of a weeknight settled around us. "Your father is going to do something at that dinner," Ethan said. I looked up. "What do you mean?" "He's going to make a point. About you. About us." He said it without heat, as a man states a fact he's observed. "He's been building to it for years." "How do you know?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a gesture I recognized as the one he used when he was choosing his words with care. "Because it's what people like your father do when they feel they've been proven right for long enough. They want an audience for the confirmation." I thought about the Christmas dinner 3 years ago. The kitchen door. The words I'd heard through it. "And you want to be there for that?" I said. "I want you to be there," he said. "And I want to be there with you." He didn't say anything else. I sat with the incomplete information and told myself he'd elaborate when he was ready. He didn't elaborate. He simply, over the following weeks, became slightly more present. More attentive in the particular way of someone who is preparing for something. He made 2 calls from the home office with the door fully closed, which was unusual. He spent one Saturday morning on his laptop with a focused expression that was different from his normal working concentration, more deliberate, less exploratory. I noticed these things. I filed them without examining them too closely, partly because I trusted him and partly because I was afraid that examining them might reveal something I wasn't ready for. That was my own form of managed ignorance, and I recognized it even as I practiced it. My mother Catherine called in mid-March. She called under the guise of organizing carpooling to the gala, which we both knew was unnecessary. We lived 20 minutes apart and had never carpooled anywhere in our lives. The real purpose of the call, which became clear in its second half, was to manage expectations. "Your father is going to say a few things about the family," she said. "He may mention your career. I just want you to know that he means it warmly." "He always means it warmly," I said. The particular flatness in my voice when I said this was something I'd worked on for years, not coldness, exactly, but the specific neutrality of someone who has processed a thing enough to hold it without reaction. "He's proud of you," she said. "In his way." In his way. The phrase did a lot of work in my family's vocabulary. It covered a range of behaviors that would have been unambiguous in any other framing. "Thank you for calling," I said. After I hung up, I sat in my classroom after the students had gone. It was a Friday afternoon, the room warm and slightly sticky with the residue of 24 small humans, and I thought about what my mother had just told me without meaning to. She had called to prepare me. Which meant something was coming. Which meant my father had said something to her about his plans for the toast. My father's retirement toast had been drafted, at least in part, with me in mind. I should have told Ethan about that call immediately. Instead, I drove home, made dinner, and said nothing about it until the following morning. I told myself I didn't want to give the evening more weight than it deserved. The honest reason was different. I didn't want to test whatever Ethan was preparing, because I wasn't sure I was ready for what the test might reveal about how much had been kept from me, even if it had been kept with care. Sophia called in early April. She called on a Sunday, which was unusual. Sophia's communications were typically efficient and weekday adjacent. Sunday calls meant something less scheduled, less managed. "I just wanted to check in," she said, in the tone she used when checking in was not the actual purpose. "I'm fine," I said. "How are you?" "Good." "Busy." A pause. "Are you bringing Ethan to the gala?" "Of course." Another pause, slightly longer. "Has he mentioned anything to you?" "About work stuff?" I looked out our living room window at the garden Ethan had planted last spring, herbs along the south fence, a climbing rose that had finally taken hold along the porch rail. "What kind of work stuff?" "I don't know, exactly." Sophia's voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before, not the confident register she usually occupied, but something more uncertain underneath it. "Someone at my office mentioned EDU Spark." I looked it up. I saw the name. EDU Spark. The name landed in my mind and connected to nothing specific at first. I knew Ethan worked in education technology. I knew the company had a name, but I had never Googled it, had never looked at the website, had never done the particular modern thing of researching your own husband's professional life because it hadn't occurred to me that there was something to find. "What about it?" I said. "Nothing," Sophia said. "Never mind. I'll see you at the gala." She hung up before I could respond. I sat with the phone in my hand and felt something shift in the specific way that a small piece of information shifts when it connects to a larger pattern you haven't yet fully mapped. Sophia had looked up EDU Spark. Sophia had found something. And Sophia, who was not a person given to uncertainty, had sounded uncertain. That evening I opened my laptop. EDU Spark was an education technology company. The homepage was clean and precise, the kind of design that communicates seriousness without performance. Adaptive learning platforms. School district partnerships. Something about equity in educational access. I scrolled to the About page, and there was a brief founding story, and there was a photograph. Ethan. Slightly younger, slightly more formal than I was used to seeing him, standing in what looked like a conference room. Founder and CEO. I read the rest of the page. Recent valuation, $200 million. I closed the laptop. I sat in the living room for a long time, in the particular stillness of someone processing information that is not bad news, exactly, but that reorganizes everything around it. Not because Ethan had lied. He hadn't, he'd told me what he did, just not at scale. Not because I felt deceived in the conventional sense. But because I understood, sitting in that living room with the closed laptop on the coffee table, why he'd been waiting. Why the gala? Why it's time. He had been carrying this, not hidden from me but unannounced to anyone who hadn't looked, while my family had been publicly dismissing him for years. While my father made comments through kitchen doors. While my mother said things were meant warmly. While Sophia gave my husband the particular courtesy she reserved for people she decided weren't worth her full attention. Ethan had let them. Deliberately. For reasons I was only beginning to understand. Even now, remembering that evening, something moves in my chest that isn't quite any single emotion. It's the feeling of realizing that the person next to you has been absorbing something on your behalf, not secretly, not manipulatively, but quietly, with a patience that was itself a form of love. He hadn't told me the scale of it not to deceive me but because he understood, better than I did, what my family's opinion of him was costing me. And he had decided to wait until he could address it in a way that made it stop. I didn't ask him about it that night. I made dinner. We ate. We talked about our week, about my students, about the climbing rows. The next morning, he came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and said, in the easy tone of someone raising a topic that has already been settled internally, "You looked it up?" "Yes," I said. He nodded once. "I was going to tell you before the gala." "Why did you wait?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted you to come to it without that information changing how you felt walking in. I wanted you to be there as yourself, not as the wife of someone your family was suddenly impressed by." I looked at him across the kitchen. "That's either the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me," I said. "Or the most complicated." "Probably both," he said. The 2 weeks before the gala had a different texture once I knew. I went back to the EDU Spark website and read it properly this time, not the shocked skim of the first evening but a real reading. The company was 7 years old. It had started as an adaptive learning tool for underserved school districts and had grown into a platform used by more than 3,000 schools across 11 states. The equity mission was not decorative, it was structural, built into the product logic in ways that I, as a teacher who had used adaptive learning software for years, recognized as genuinely considered. Ethan had built this. While driving our practical car and wearing simple clothes and being described by my father as a pleasant nonentity. I thought about the Friday afternoons he'd spent in the home office while I graded papers at the kitchen table. The morning calls with the door closed. The deliberate vagueness about scale that I had read as modesty and that was, I now understood, a considered choice. Looking back now at the Christmas dinner 3 years ago, the kitchen door, my father's voice, the words I'd heard and processed alone, I understand that Ethan had heard it too. Not through a door. Directly, that same evening, from a comment my father had made at the table when he thought I was in the kitchen. Ethan had told me this later, in the week before the gala, with the flatness of someone reporting a fact that no longer had the power to wound him. He had heard my father's assessment of his worth and had said nothing. Not because he lacked a response. Because he had a better one in mind and was willing to wait for the right moment to deliver it. I called Rachel on a Wednesday. "I need to tell you something," I said. I told her about EDU Spark. About the valuation. About Ethan's reasoning for waiting. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. He built a $200 million company, she said slowly, and went to your family's Christmas dinners and let them talk to him like that. Yes, I said. For 4 years. 6, if you count before we were married. Another silence. Nora. What is he planning to do at this gala? I don't know exactly, I said. He hasn't told me the specific plan. Just that it's time. Are you scared? I thought about the question, really thought about it, the way it deserved. No, I said. That's the part that surprises me. I'm not scared at all. 3 days before the gala, Uncle Philip called. Philip was my father's younger brother, warmer than Vincent, somewhat outside the main circuits of family power, given to occasional observations about the family dynamic that were more honest than anyone else's. He called sometimes to check in on me in the genuine way, not the managed way. I heard Ethan, has been doing something interesting, he said. How did you hear? I said. Your sister called me. She seemed, I don't know. Worried isn't quite the right word. Calculating, maybe. He paused. She wanted to know if I knew anything about it. What did you tell her? That I didn't. Which was true. A pause. Is there something I should know before this dinner, Nora? I thought about what Ethan had said, about wanting me to arrive as myself, without the information changing my posture. I thought about whether that principle extended to Uncle Philip. Come early, I said. And sit somewhere you can see the room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, the surprised kind. Understood, he said. The night before the gala, Ethan and I sat on the porch in the April evening, the climbing rose just beginning to show buds along the rail. You could tell me the plan, I said. I could, he said. But you're not going to. I think it's better if you respond to it the way anyone in that room will respond to it, he said. Genuinely. Without having processed it in advance. I looked at the rose. You've been planning this for a while. I've been waiting for the right occasion for a while, he said. Your father handed me one. What if it goes badly? Ethan turned to look at me. Define badly. I thought about it. My father loses face. My mother is embarrassed. Sophia has to recalibrate everything she thought she knew about us. Yes, he said. That's what I expect will happen. That doesn't bother you? What bothers me, he said, with a quiet precision that I recognized as his version of intensity, is watching you sit at table 9 at your father's event and hear yourself described as a little school project. That's the thing I've decided I'm done watching. I didn't say anything for a while. The evening was mild and the neighborhood was quiet and the rose was putting out buds along the porch rail like it had decided this was a good year. I had spent 10 years managing my family's dismissal of my choices. I had gotten good at it, good at the smile, good at the measured response, good at the internal processing that kept things functional. And it had cost me something I hadn't fully quantified until that evening on the porch, the accumulated weight of performing equanimity in the face of something that wasn't equanimous. I had been spending energy I could have used elsewhere on maintaining an appearance of being fine. Ethan had been watching that expenditure for 6 years. And he had decided it was going to end. The Harrington Hotel ballroom had the specific grandeur of a space designed to make its occupants feel they have arrived somewhere significant. We arrived at 7:15. The room was filling, 200 guests in formal dress, the particular social hum of an event where most attendees know each other well enough to be comfortable but not so well as to have run out of performance. The centerpieces were, as I had estimated, significant. My father was near the front of the room, holding court with a group of men I recognized as business colleagues, wearing the expression of a man at the apex of a long narrative about himself. He saw us arrive. He nodded, the nod of a host acknowledging a guest of minor significance, and returned to his conversation. My mother found us near the bar and kissed my cheek with the warmth she deployed at events. She looked at Ethan with the pleasant vacancy she usually wore for him, the expression of someone acknowledging a presence that doesn't require close attention. "You both look wonderful," she said. "Table 9 is just there." Table 9 was near the back. I had not needed to see the seating chart to expect this. Sophia was already seated. She looked at Ethan when we sat down with an expression I had never seen her direct at him before, a careful, assessing look that was entirely different from her usual dismissive ease. She opened her mouth, closed it, and said, "Hi, Ethan." He smiled at her with complete pleasantness. "Sophia. Good to see you." She said nothing else. She spent most of the pre-dinner period on her phone, which was itself unusual for someone who managed social situations with practiced attention. Uncle Philip was at a table near the window. He caught my eye from across the room and lifted his glass slightly. The dinner was served. My father moved through the room with the ease of a man who has organized this particular performance for months. He stopped at every table, at our table, briefly, to say something about it being good to have the whole family together, with the specific emphasis on whole that I had learned meant something was being illustrated rather than expressed. The toasts began at 9. Various people spoke, colleagues, a business partner, Sophia, who was polished and brief and said exactly the right things in exactly the right order. My mother said something warm and well-structured. Uncle Philip said something genuine and slightly tangential, which was his particular gift. Then my father stood. He spoke for 4 minutes. It covered the company, his legacy, his vision, his pride in what he'd built. Sophia was mentioned specifically, at length, with the warmth of genuine pride. And then he looked toward table 9, with the indulgent expression of a man about to be generous, and said, "And of course Nora is still doing her little school project. Teaching children. We're very proud of her too." The words landed exactly as they always landed. The smile was exactly the smile I had seen 100 times. The slight diminishment in "to," the word that placed my work after everything else, as an addition rather than an equivalence, was precisely calibrated. I kept my face still. And Ethan stood up. The room noticed immediately the particular hush of a social gathering when something unscripted happens. My father paused in his seat, expression reconfiguring. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply stood at table 9 in the back of the ballroom and spoke in the clear, unhurried register he used in every situation, and what he said had the specific quality of someone who has been holding a thing a long time and has decided the moment is exactly right. "I'd like to add something," he said, "if that's all right." My father, from social reflex rather than genuine invitation, gestured for him to proceed. "Nora's school project, as you've described it, has produced 24 students this year alone who can read things they couldn't read in September. I watch her prepare for those students on Sunday evenings, and I watch what happens when she talks about them, and I want to say clearly, in this room, that what she does is not a small thing." The hush in the room deepened. "I also want to introduce myself properly," Ethan said. "Since I don't think we've had that opportunity in 6 years." He paused, the slight pause of a man deciding the exact word. "I'm the founder and CEO of EDU Spark. We're an education technology company. Our most recent valuation was $200 million. We currently partner with 3,000 plus schools in 11 states, most of them underserved districts." He let the number sit in the room for a moment. I mention this not because I think it changes anything about the last 6 years, or about what Nora does, or about what this family values. I mention it because I've been sitting at table 9 for 4 years and I'd like, just once, to be in a room with the complete information present. He sat down. The room did not erupt. It did the more damaging thing, it recalibrated, audibly, in the particular murmur of 200 people revising and understanding simultaneously. I could see my father's face from across the room. He had gone very still, with the expression of someone who has just walked into a room that has different dimensions than they expected. Sophia had her hand over her mouth. Not in shock, exactly. In something more complex, the expression of a person who already knew part of this and is watching the rest arrive. My mother was looking at her hands. Uncle Philip was looking at me. Something broke open in my chest in that moment that wasn't triumph and wasn't grief. It was something older than either, the feeling of having been seen, publicly and precisely, in a room where I had spent years being unseen. Ethan had not stood up to humiliate my father. He had stood up to make me visible. The $200 million number was not the point. It was the thing he'd used to get the room's attention long enough to say the thing that actually mattered: what she does is not a small thing. I reached for his hand under the table. He took it without looking. My father came to table 9 20 minutes later, after the room had settled back into its social rhythms, slightly altered, slightly more charged, but functioning. He stood at the edge of our table with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not the indulgence. Not the managed disappointment. Something more stripped back than either. "You could have told me," he said to Ethan. "Yes," Ethan said. "I could have." A pause. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was waiting to see if it would matter to you either way," Ethan said. "Whether I had $200 million or nothing. Whether that changed how you spoke about your daughter." My father was quiet for a moment. He looked at me, really looked at me, with none of the usual social overlay. Just looked. "I don't think I've been fair to you," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. Maybe ever. It wasn't enough, not by itself, not in that moment. But it was real. I could feel the difference between performance and real, by now. "No," I said. "You haven't." He nodded once. Then he walked back across the room. The drive home from the Harrington was quiet in the particular way that follows events that have changed something irreversibly. Ethan drove. I sat with the window slightly open, the April air cool on my face, watching the city move past in the way it does late at night, emptier, more honest somehow, without the day's performance covering it. We didn't speak for most of the drive, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have been through something together and are letting it settle. At a red light, I said, "You've been planning that for a while." "I've been waiting for him to give me the occasion," he said. "He's been reliable about it." "You let them do it for 6 years." He looked at the light. "I let them do it until I understood that it was costing you more than I'd initially calculated. That was the thing that changed. That was the thing that changed." I sat with that sentence for a long time. He hadn't acted on his own discomfort. He had acted when he understood the cost to me. That distinction mattered in a way I couldn't fully articulate that night but have thought about often since. My father called 3 days later. The call was brief. Vincent had never been a man for long phone conversations, and had the texture of something that had been prepared but not over-rehearsed. He said he'd been thinking. He said some of what had been said at the gala had been unfair. He said he'd like to have lunch, if I was open to it. I said I was open to it. We met the following week at a restaurant midway between our houses, neutral ground, a practical choice that I appreciated. He arrived first, which was itself a small signal. Vincent was a man who expected others to arrive to him. He stood when I came in, which was another. The conversation was careful and incomplete, the kind that covers some of what needs covering and leaves the rest for later, because doing it all at once would be more than either of us could hold. He said something about not having understood what I'd built. He said something about Ethan that was less complete than what needed to be said, but more than nothing. I said something about the pattern of years that I had not previously been able to say directly, and he listened to it without deflecting. It wasn't reconciliation, exactly. It was the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one that had dropped a pretense and was testing whether something honest could grow in the space that was left. I had spent 32 years seeking from my father something he wasn't able to give in the form I'd wanted it. His approval, shaped the way his approval was shaped, was never going to land on who I actually was, because who I actually was had never been what he was looking at. He had been looking at a position he needed filled, and I had not filled it, and he had called that a disappointment. The lunch was the first conversation we'd had where he was actually looking at me. Sophia called 2 weeks after the gala. She was characteristically direct, more direct than she usually allowed herself to be with me, which I recognized as a form of respect. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Several, probably." "Yes," I said. "I knew about EDU Spark," she said. "I'd heard a rumor 3 months ago and I looked it up and I didn't tell you." "Why not?" A pause. "Because I didn't want to have to reconfigure everything. I'd gotten used to a version of your life that made my version look better by comparison. That's not something I'm proud of." It was honest. Uncomfortably honest. I held it for a moment. "I appreciate you saying it," I said. "Can we have dinner sometime?" she said. "Not a family thing. Just us." "Yes," I said. "Let's do that." In May, my class planted a garden. It was something I'd been doing for 3 years, a small raised bed on the school's south side, a spring project for the end of the year, something the students could see complete before summer. We planted tomatoes and herbs and one large sunflower that became, by the end of the semester, a minor subject of classroom mythology. My student Lily, 7 years old, meticulous, deeply serious about the sunflower's progress, asked me one afternoon while we were weeding whether I liked my job. "Yes," I said. "Very much." "My mom says teachers don't get paid enough," Lily said. "Your mom is right," I said. "But you still like it?" I looked at the sunflower, which was about 8 inches tall at that point and already leaning toward the light with the committed energy of something that knows what it needs. "Some things you do because they pay well," I said. "And some things you do because they matter. It's good when you can find something that does both. But if you have to choose, I'd pick the one that matters." Lily considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything. "My mom says that's easy to say." "It's easier to do when someone believes in you," I said. She went back to weeding. I stayed crouched beside the sunflower for a moment, in the spring sun, with the smell of turned earth and the sound of 24 small humans working around me. I thought about Ethan, standing at table 9 in the back of the ballroom. The way he'd spoken, not loud, not theatrical, just clear. The particular clarity of someone who has decided that the time for managing other people's comfort is over. What I understood, that afternoon in the school garden, was something I hadn't been able to articulate at the gala or in the week after it, that the validation I'd been seeking from my father was never going to come in the form I needed it, because the form I needed it in required him to see me clearly, and that was something he'd been declining to do for 30 years. Ethan standing up that night hadn't changed what my father saw. It had changed what I needed him to see. I had stopped needing it. Not dramatically. Not as a decision. Just as a quiet, completed process, like a thing that finishes because it has run its full course. I am 32 years old and I teach 3rd grade, and I am married to a man who builds education technology companies and spends his Sunday evenings asking me about my week in a way that suggests he genuinely wants to know. My father and I have lunch occasionally now. The lunches are imperfect and somewhat careful and more honest than anything we managed in the previous 3 decades. That is what it is, not what I wanted at 22, but something real. My mother sent me flowers on Teacher Appreciation Day in May. No note. Just flowers. I put them in the classroom where the students could see them. Sophia and I have had 2 dinners. They are easier than I expected. She is sharper and funnier in a one-on-one setting than she ever was in the family context, which makes a kind of sense. In the family system, she had always been playing a role. Without the audience, she was more herself. The sunflower in the school garden grew to 5 feet by the last week of school. Lily measured it every Monday and recorded the height in a notebook she kept specifically for this purpose. On the last day of the semester, she presented the notebook to me as a gift. "So you remember this year," she said. "I will," I said. She seemed satisfied with that and went to find her backpack. I stood in the garden with the notebook and the 5-foot sunflower and the particular end-of-year quiet that always feels like both a conclusion and a beginning. I didn't need my father to say I'd chosen correctly. I didn't need the room at the Harrington Hotel to recalibrate, though it had, and something in that recalibration had mattered. What I needed was what I already had: the work, the students, the sunflower measuring notebook, and Ethan at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings asking about my week. It was enough. It always had been. I just hadn't been sure of that until someone stood up in a ballroom and said it clearly. What this story ultimately exposes is not a dramatic conflict but a structural one: the way a family system built around a single definition of success damages everyone it touches, including the people it appears to reward. Robert had organized his world around visible achievement, revenue, scale, titles, the markers of success that could be named and measured and displayed at a retirement gala. This framework had been consistently applied to both daughters, but with different outcomes. Sophia fit it and received recognition, Nora didn't fit it and received a particular kind of patient disappointment that was, in its own way, its own form of cruelty. Not anger. Not rejection. Just the sustained gentle pressure of a parent who wanted a different child and kept making that want visible. The damage that kind of sustained disappointment does is specific. It doesn't break you. It erodes the confidence that your own judgment is trustworthy. Nora had chosen teaching because she loved it, because she was good at it, because it mattered to her in the way that mattered. Her father had consistently responded to that choice as though she had made a navigational error that could still, potentially, be corrected. And 32 years of that response had left her, despite everything she'd built, still arriving at his events and still waiting, on some level, for a sign that she'd been right. Ethan had understood this dynamic more clearly than Nora had been able to, partly because he was watching it from outside the family system rather than from inside it. He could see what it cost her in a way she couldn't, because she had normalized the cost over decades. His decision to wait, to absorb years of dismissal without deploying his company's valuation as a defense, was not passivity. It was strategic clarity about what the moment needed. He was waiting for an occasion that would allow him to address not the personal slight but the structural problem, that Nora's family had never been forced to encounter the full reality of what she and her husband had built, and in the absence of that encounter, they had been free to maintain a comfortable fiction. The $200 million figure is worth examining carefully, because it's easy to read the climax as a story about money proving worth. That reading misses the point. Ethan didn't stand up to prove he was wealthy. He stood up because Robert had just, in front of 200 people, described his wife's decade of work as a school project. The number was the vehicle. The message was the destination: what she does is not a small thing. The validation Nora had been seeking from her father for 30 years arrived, in the end, not from him but from the person who had been watching her work every day. What the story reveals about family systems is that the person who measures worth by external markers will always be vulnerable to having those markers disrupted. Robert's framework required Ethan to be a pleasant non-entity. The moment that requirement was publicly contradicted, the entire evaluative system he'd been using collapsed, not just about Ethan, but about every judgment he'd made using the same method. That's why his response to Ethan at the table was so stripped back. He wasn't just being corrected about a son-in-law. He was being corrected about the validity of the measurement tool. The conditional reconciliation at the end is the story's most honest element. Robert and Nora don't rebuild their relationship on a wave of realized love. They begin, carefully, to have honest conversations. That is appropriate. 30 years of accumulated dismissal can't be undone by a public revelation. What it can do is create the conditions for a different kind of relationship, one based on seeing rather than on projecting. The accumulation effect in this story operated silently for 3 decades, then reached its threshold in a ballroom. every comment, every table 9 placement, every little school project, none of them individually catastrophic, all of them together forming a structure that Nora had been living inside without fully mapping. The gala didn't create a crisis. It made an existing one finally visible. What I find most quietly devastating about this story isn't the moment at the gala. It's the years before it, all the Sunday evenings Nora spent grading papers while her husband built a $200 million company across the hallway, and her family spent those same years deciding, without looking, that neither of them amounted to much. The painful irony isn't that they were wrong about Ethan's financial worth. It's that they were wrong about Nora's worth, and that was visible all along, in her classroom, in her students, in the sunflower notebook that a 7-year-old kept so she wouldn't forget the year. No valuation required. I think what Ethan understood, and what Nora learned, is that seeking recognition from people who have decided not to give it is a particular kind of work that produces nothing. You can spend a lifetime being exactly who you are and getting very good at it, and some people will still see what they decided to see before they ever looked. The question isn't whether you can change their minds. It's whether you can stop needing to. Nora found the answer. It was already in her classroom.